Well, hi there. Do you want to learn how to add textures to your vector artwork? Well, you're in luck because that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hello and welcome. My name is Doodlemachine. Thank you for joining me for another technique discussion video. Today we're going to be talking about adding textures to vector artwork. We're going to talk about what it means and why you'd want to add textures to your vector art. We'll look at some examples of how I've added textures to a few of my illustrations. I'm going to show you step by step how to do it. And finally, I'm going to give you a few quick tricks and tips. So let's get into it. So the video today all about adding textures to your vector artwork. And it's a super easy way to kind of take your vectors to, like a level beyond just being a vector. Vectors tend to have a very flat appearance. That's one of the reasons that you use vectors, is because of the crisp, flat, sleek look that they give. But sometimes it's nice to bring a little texture in. Adding texture is easy to do with raster art. With raster art, you can add textures as you're working. You can use the raster program and the brushes to literally just paint textures into the shapes that you've drawn or painted. And raster art really doesn't need any extra textures added to it because the method itself is just so full of texture already. Now, adding textures is not so easy to do with vectors. With vectors, there's a couple ways you can do it, and I'm going to show you today a method that I've used for a long time. It's the easiest method and it works great. And it involves using an image of a texture, bringing that into your vector program, and applying that as a texture over top of your vector. And there are some clever ways you can do that to add some complexity to the texture so it doesn't just appear as a flat texture just smacked over top of the whole thing. So this is basically the way that I do it. The way I do it is I have a texture that I've made outside of Illustrator, and I bring it into Illustrator and I apply that with a color blend mode over top of the vector art. Now you want to experiment with the different color blend modes. The basic one that I usually go with is an overlay blend mode, and that gives it the ability to pull out the lights and the darks in the texture at the same time, as opposed to a color burn or a color dodge, which is focused on either adding darks or just lights from the texture into the vector. Okay, so let's get into my method, the way that I do it for adding textures to vector art. Now, just adding a texture from outside of Illustrator into your Illustrator document, that's the easy way. It works, but it doesn't look great. The reason it doesn't look great is because the edges of the texture where it overlaps shapes, you can tell with your eye that it's just a simple texture that's just placed over top, just kind of slapped on. And there was no real thought to how the texture interacts between the foreground and the background. You can see how different shapes and strokes in the texture go across the edge of the foreground to the background, and it really kind of kills the illusion that you're looking at something that has a painterly origin. So the way that I like to do this is to handle it with a mask. So basically what I'll do is I will put the texture in on the background, and then I will separately turn the foreground subject into a mask and use that to mask the foreground texture separately from the background texture. This lets you choose just the right area of your texture so that the foreground and the background have distinct looks to them, and it doesn't appear like it's a single texture slapped on the whole image. And you can actually add as many masks as you want. I'm going to be showing you how to just apply a mask to one layer to keep it separately from the background layer. But you can really, sky's the limit. You can put as many masks as you want. So here I'm going to show you a couple illustrations I've done in the past and the method that I've used for it. So on this one, this is just one single texture. You can see here I have the foreground, and I turned this into a mask and I just put one texture over the whole thing. It worked fine in this case to just have one texture without needing to mask individual objects. That's not always the case, but if you can make it work just by using one texture over the whole image, go right ahead. There's nothing wrong with that as long as it looks good. Here's another one that I did, and this one needed two layers of textures. So you can see I have a background layer and a foreground layer. The background layer has one texture applied, and the foreground layer has a masked shape, and within that masked shape, there is another texture. And what you want to do is be able to position the texture right within that masked shape so that the texture has a really good position to bring out the lights and the darks in your image. Here's one more that I've done, and this one, again, it has a texture in the background, you can see there, and then I did a separate texture in the foreground. And again, this one's just done with the foreground mask, and within that, there's an image of a texture, and you can move that around to choose just the right location so that the texture works perfectly with your foreground layer. So I'm going to be showing you how to do that right now. So there are two things you're going to need for this to work. You're going to need a piece of vector art that has a separate background and foreground, if you're going to be using this masking method. If you're just going to be applying a texture to the whole thing, it doesn't really matter if the background and foreground are separate. You will need a texture of some sort. Now, you can get a texture in a variety of ways. You can find a texture online. That's kind of a faux pas, because you don't want to be using somebody else's texture in your art, because then it gets into a situation of how much of your art is their art. So I always prefer just to cut out the middleman and make my own textures so that it's entirely on me. Now, for making your own textures, you can either use a painted texture. You can actually get some paint and paint a texture and bring those photographs as a black and white image into your texture archive to be able to use in your vectors. The method that I prefer, and the one that I'd recommend, is to actually paint your own textures digitally. So the way you do this is you use a digital painting program like Photoshop or Painter. Here I am using Artrage. You want to make your painted texture starting with a neutral gray and adding darks and lights, and really just using the tools in the program to create interesting brush strokes and texture shapes. Kind of in Artrage here, you can use the palette knife to kind of scrape them together and bring out different kind of just weird little quirks of the program, the way it handles the paint, to create a really interesting varied texture. Some areas will be dark, some areas will be light, which is exactly what you want. So that way you can use different areas of the texture to bring out lights and darks in different ways in your vector art. Okay, so you've got everything you need. Let's get into how to actually bring it into Adobe Illustrator, how to apply your texture to the different layers in the different ways that I've already shown. All right, here we are in Adobe Illustrator, and this is the vector illustration that I'm going to be applying textures to. Now, you can see that I've already prepared it. I have my background on its own layer, and that's separate from my foreground on its own layer. So what you're gonna wanna do is create a layer above your background, but under your foreground for your texture. Now, I have the texture that I showed you earlier, me painting in Artrage. So I'm gonna bring that into Illustrator right now. And you just do that by making sure you have your texture layer highlighted, and you just drag the file right onto your Illustrator document. Now, this came in really big, so I'm gonna just scale this down, and I'm gonna kind of just roughly position it where I think it would be an interesting addition to the background color. So I want some lights and some darks. You can change the size to use exactly the part of the texture that you want. This is good enough for now. And then I'm going to apply the overlay blending mode from the transparency palette. So if I apply the overlay, it's going to add some darks and lights from my texture. If I only wanted the darks, I would use either a multiply or a color burn. Color burn tends to work better if you have just colored backgrounds. Or if I wanted lights, I would use a color dodge. So there's the color dodge, there's the color burn. Color burn's pretty dark in this one because the background's already pretty dark. That's why I like the overlay, because it adds lights and dark. So I'm gonna say that's good enough for now. Okay, so the background's done. I'm gonna lock this layer. We are done with that. Now to move on to the foreground. So the foreground is the tricky part. You're gonna need to turn your foreground art into a mask that is going to contain the texture. Now, with this illustration that I've done, there are lots of different types of shapes here. There are shapes with gradients, there are strokes, brush strokes, there are custom brush strokes, transparent shapes as well. And all of this means that this is not going to be a simple image to create a mask for. But I have a pretty quick method that works 99% of the time. So I'll show you what I'm gonna do with this one, and hopefully something similar will work for you. Okay, so what I do is I'm gonna copy everything from the foreground onto another layer. Copy and paste in place. So this is 2 layers. This is my mask and this is my art. So this is gonna be the mask. So what I'm gonna do is highlight everything and I'm gonna expand its appearance. And I'm gonna do it more than once. I'm gonna go to Object Expand. So just make sure when you are using your expand that you're not expanding the fill. You only want to be expanding the strokes. The fills are fine the way they are. You don't want to turn your fills into a bunch of shapes. So we're gonna only select object, we're gonna deselect fill, and we're only gonna want to expand our strokes. So now I've expanded it twice and we should have all of the pieces properly expanded. So now I know that there are no strokes left in this image. What I'm gonna do now is highlight everything, and then using the Pathfinder palette, right over here. If you're not familiar with the Pathfinder palette, stay tuned. I'm going to be doing a tutorial just on the Pathfinder palette. It's full of a bunch of great tools. So what I'm going to do over here in the Pathfinder palette is I'm going to apply the merge filter. And what this is going to do is completely flatten all of the shapes together so that there are no more overlapping shapes. So the merge Pathfinder tool has a bit of a quirk to it where it flattens everything, creates shapes, but it also creates the negative shapes. So I want to get rid of those shapes that have no stroke and no fill. And the way that I'm going to do that, I'm just going to ungroup this. I'm going to highlight an area like right here. You can see that there's a negative shape in there. So I know that there's going to be a stroke without a fill in there. So I'm going to highlight both and then deselect the outside shape. So now I have, you can see up here, no stroke, no fill. So I'm going to go to select, same, fill and stroke. So now it has selected all of the paths that have no stroke and no fill, and I'm just going to delete those. So now all of the shapes that are in this layer are filled colored shapes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight everything and I'm going to give this a color. One color for all the shapes. Then I'm going to go back over to the Pathfinder palette, and instead of using the merge, this time I'm going to use unite. It's one of the shape modes, and it's going to take out all of the paths on the inside of the shape and just kind of flatten it down so only the outside is an actual path. Okay, there we go. So I have an object that is a vector outline of my entire foreground. There's one more thing we have to do here. We have to turn this into a compound path because there are shapes outside this one shape that if I actually ungroup this, you'll see it's separate shapes. You can see up here, there are a couple shapes that aren't a part of this. If you only care about your main shape, then go right ahead and turn this into your mask. But I'm going to show you right now to unite them all and turn them into one actual shape, because a clipping mask can only be one shape. So to turn all of these various paths into one path to use as a clipping mask, you need to highlight them all and turn them into a compound path. And you do that by going to Object, Compound Path, Make. So now, even if I ungroup this, I can still select it and I can see that all of the paths, even on the outside of this layer, are part of this same shape. So I can now use this to mask my texture. Bit of a convoluted way of going about it, but this is a method that works basically every time for me, so I really wanted to show you exactly how I did it. All right, let's add a texture to this layer. I'm just going to copy this background texture for now. Copy. Paste that behind into my foreground layer, and I'm going to put it in a different position. Maybe I'm going to put it on an angle, and just for variety. You don't want to go through all this work masking a shape and then have the texture just match up with the background when you could have just slapped it over the whole thing anyway. So I'm gonna highlight the texture and the masked shape in front of it, and I'm gonna turn this into a clipping mask. I'm gonna go Object, Clipping Mask, Make. The object is very complex. Do you want to do it anyway? Yes, I do. That's okay. Boom. So now you can see that my foreground texture, here I'll just turn off the background ones, my foreground texture is masked behind the shape of my figure. So this texture within the mask already has a blend mode applied to it. If I use my direct selection tool, I can select the texture, not just the object. and I can see it's already applied with an overlay. Put whatever kind of filter you want on this. Let's say you want to bring out the darks in the foreground, but the lights in the background. There's no reason that you can't do different filters on your background versus your foreground. I'm going to just leave it as an overlay because I want the lights and the darks. But here I'm going to choose a different spot, and I'm going to reposition this texture so it's just right, so that it has just the right effect on the foreground. There we go. I like that. I like how it's bringing out the highlights in the top part of her hair, but the dark shadows in the lower part of her hair. And there's no part to my eyes that makes this feel particularly unnatural. And we are going to call that done. Before we wrap things up, I'm going to give you a few extra quick tips for this method. So my first tip is to keep an archive of your textures. Keep a folder just full of all the textures you've ever made and used in your artwork, so that way you have lots of variety to choose from when you're making your vectors. You don't want to have to make a new texture every time, so you're going to want to reuse some of your old textures, but the more you have in your arsenal, the better it's going to be to choose just the right texture for the illustration that you're making at that time. Another tip is similar to the first one, that's don't use the same texture over and over and over. Don't just find one texture and think, oh, that's the texture that works perfect for me, so I'm just going to use it in every illustration, because it really makes your entire portfolio feel kind of homogeneous. You don't want to use the same texture. You want to be adding some variety. Fine to use a texture over and over if you find one that works, but don't use it on every single illustration. Another tip is the more shapes that you mask individually, the more control you have over the look of the image. Take that illustration of the girl I just did. Maybe I would want to turn her hair into a separate mask from her body's texture. The more complexity you add to your masks, the deeper and more control you have over the actual outcome of the image, obviously. And just adding textures to individual objects or to big areas, foreground, middle ground, background, and the sky, the more different kind of levels of textures you have, the more kind of deep and complex your image will be. Another technique would be to really experiment with the blend modes. I showed you a few quick ones. My go-to blend mode for the transparency on the texture is to just slap on an overlay blend mode, but there are others you want to try out too. Color burn and color dodge for bringing out darks and lights in the colors of your image. But there's a few other ones in there. Experiment with the blend modes and pick the one that's just right for your image. Sometimes the picture you have in your mind of how the image should turn out might not be the actual decision you choose, because maybe you'll apply a color dodge and you're like, ooh, that looks pretty cool. I think I'll just leave that the way it is, even though it ends up being more light than I initially anticipated. So experiment with the blend modes for sure. And my final tip is to not just stick with one texture on each layer. You can layer textures. You can apply one texture over your background, for instance, as an overlay, and then add another texture or the same texture but rotated and sized in a different way as another overlay, or as a color dodge or burn over top of your overlay. And just the overlapping textures add a lot more strokes and a lot more interesting variation than just sticking with one texture each time. And that brings us to the end. I hope this was helpful. I hope you found something of value in this. Let me know, please, in the comments below. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. If there's anything I did that I didn't explain properly, if you have questions about other techniques I've used in other videos that you'd like me to do tutorial videos or explanation videos on, please just let me know in the comments. I'd love to chat about it with you, and I'd love to help you out. Hey, while you're down there, click the thumbs up if you like the video. Click the thumbs down if you disliked it. Subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. And as always, thanks for watching.